The discovery. The box turned up on a Wednesday, the kind of grey Midwestern afternoon that made the whole town feel like it was holding its breath. Rain hung in the air but never quite fell. In the kitchen of a narrow clapboard house on Sycamore Street, Anna Whitman set the box on the table and studied it the way you study a stranger's face, trying to decide if it means trouble or luck. It had been buried in the crawl space, tucked behind a cracked terracotta pipe and a drift of old newspaper. The plumber found it first. "Ma'am," he'd called, voice echoing through the floorboards, "there's something down here you might want." Then he slid it toward her like a returning tide, dented metal, army green, a rusted latch the color of dried blood, an ammo can from another war and another century. Anna wasn't a person who rattled easily. She was 41, a high school counselor who spent her days watching 17-year-olds test the edges of their lives, then coaxing them back from cliffs they didn't know they were standing on. She was practical and steady and not much given to ceremony. But when she loosened the latch and caught the first sweet, stale breath of what was inside, old paper, camphor, something that might have been tobacco, she sat down without meaning to. On top lay a folded flag, smaller than a funeral triangle, the kind they tucked into back pockets on parade days. Beneath it, a wool cap with a moth-eaten brim, a brass dog-tag chain coiled like a sleeping snake, and under that, wrapped in butcher paper that had yellowed to the color of tea, a stack of letters bound with twine. On the top sheet, in precise block capitals smudged by a thumb decades gone, someone had written, "PFC Thomas E. Kelly, U.S. Army, 7th Infanterie Division, chosen, 1950 dive chosen, 1950 div chosen, 1950 dive, chosen 1950 dive, chosen 1950 dive chosen, 1950 div chosen, 1950 dive, chosen 1950 dive, chosen 1950 dive chosen, 1950 dive chosen, naam to the dive chosen Crawfully, Machisti Kitramodine 50, Bickenventoctale. Anna's hands paused on the twine. The name wasn't hers, but it wasn't unfamiliar either. In a town like this, names were a river. You could trace them back as far as you wanted, find them carved into church benches and baseball trophies and headstones polished smooth by the weather. Kelly had a row in the cemetery near the fence line. She'd walked past it 100 times with her jogging stroller when Ellie was little. Now Ellie was 12 and thought the world began with Wi-Fi. The kitchen clock ticked, rain threatened, and then thought better of it. Anna had papers to grade and a permission slip to sign and chicken thawing in the sink. None of it moved. She slid the twine free and lifted the top letter carefully, as though the paper might bruise. The envelope was unsealed, the flap tucked in. No stamp, no postmark, never sent. The handwriting inside was neat and hopeful in a way handwriting isn't anymore. She read the salutation and felt the room tilt. "Dear Rosie." The first paragraph managed to be both ordinary and not. The soldier Thomas wrote about the cold, about how it made a sound of its own when it moved, about borrowed socks and coffee boiled black. He asked after a dog named Scout, after the radiator that clanked in the apartment on Birch Street, after her mother's ankles and the stubborn lilac bush he never could get to bloom. He promised he was being careful. He promised he was eating. He promised. The second paragraph held the weight. "They tell us we might move again tonight. I don't know how far and I don't know for how long," which you could paint on a sign and it would be the motto of the army. The fellows are quiet. Moran is drawing a deck of cards on scrap paper because the real ones turned to paste after the last march. Miller sings to himself and says it keeps the frost off your lungs. If he's right, he'll live to be 100. I never thought snow could feel like an enemy, I never thought wind could pun. Anna let out a breath. She didn't realize she'd been holding. She kept reading. She couldn't not. The letter was threaded with a kind of practical love, the kind you only see in old photographs and in people who've learned not to waste words. He asked Rosie to put $5 in the bank each month, if she could, and if she couldn't, not to worry. He asked her not to tell his mother about the part where his boots stuck to his socks when he slept. He said he dreamed of roast chicken and her hair. He said the men were brave in ordinary ways, which was the only bravery that mattered. He said, "Tell the kid next door I'll teach him to throw a curve when I get back." He said, "When I get back, like a man stacking kindling against a storm. And then, halfway down the second page, the handwriting sharpened as if his hand had steadied, or the ground had. A single line stood by itself, clear and unadorned. If this one never reaches you, know that I carried you in my left pocket. Anna pressed her thumb to that sentence, not to smudge it but to feel it, as if ink could still hold temperature. She looked up, suddenly aware of her own kitchen again, the magnet-crammed refrigerator, the drawing Ellie had done in second grade of their house as a square with a triangle hat, the splotch of blue paint on the baseboard where she'd missed with the roller the day she'd decided the room needed brightening. The present tugged at her sleeve, but the past had taken a seat. There were more letters, dozens, dates in a slow, relentless march from October to December of 1950. Some were long, some no more than a page and a closing. All my love, Tom. A few were half-finished, sentences trailing off like a breath held too long. One had a dark oval stain in the corner. Coffee, maybe, or blood. She didn't want to guess wrong. Under the letters lay a photograph. 4 boys in parkas, faces raw with windburn, teeth bared in grins too big for the weather. Someone had scratched their names in faint pencil along the bottom edge. Kelly, Moran, Miller, Jensen. Behind them a world of white climbed to a horizon that looked like a blade. The men stood close, shoulders leaned inward, the way men do when the only warm thing in the world is each other. Anna turned the photo over. On the back, in the same careful printing as the envelope, a place named Changjin Reservoir, and beneath that, a date, Dec 1, 1950. She knew enough history to feel a little cold in her own warm kitchen. Her grandfather had called it Chosen in his stories, said the word like a prayer and a warning. He'd been Navy, far from the ice but close enough to hear men talk about it later in bars. The march out, the ambush, the Black River frozen like iron, and the sky that never got light. The chosen few, he'd say, and his mouth would twist in a complicated way, pride and grief arguing behind his teeth. Anna set the photograph down carefully and reached back into the box. Beneath the last letter was a smaller envelope, heavier, sealed with a strip of paper gone brittle with time. On the front, in a different hand, bolder, official, the words, "Property of Mrs. Rose Kelly, to be delivered by any friend." Anna stared at it. She tried to imagine how an envelope like that ended up in her crawl space. This had been her house for 8 years, but before that it belonged to Edna and Walt Greeley, and before that to Edna's sister Rose, a name that landed in the middle of the kitchen like a dropped dish. Mrs. Rose Kelly, Birch Street, a lilac bush that wouldn't bloom, the river circling back, the back door creaked. Ellie blew in with the weather, cheeks pink, backpack half unzipped, sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. "Mom, coach says we need 3 volunteers for Saturday or else we forfeit our next game, which is not fair because what's that?" Anna put a hand over the open box without thinking. An old army thing the plumber found. Careful with it. Ellie's eyes widened in that particular way 12-year-olds manage when they smell a story. "Is there treasure?" "Letters," Anna said. "From the Korean War. A soldier wrote them to a woman named Rosie." "That's like ancient," Ellie said. "Reverent and merciless all at once. Can we read them?" Anna hesitated. She thought of the line about the left pocket. She thought of a woman waiting for a man who might not have come home, of a mailbox that clanked shut on empty afternoons, of the sound of footsteps that weren't his on a stairwell that knew the difference. "Maybe not all of them," she said. "Not yet." The girl's attention slid, as it often did, from history to hunger. "Is the chicken ready?" "In 10, Anna said, which was generous. "Wash up." When Ellie had gone, Anna picked up the official-looking envelope again. The seal crackled under her thumb. She slid a butter knife under the flap and worked it loose, careful as a surgeon. Inside she found a single page typed on army letterhead, the ink soft-edged from a ribbon that had been asked to say too much for too long. It wasn't long. They never are. The army regretted to inform, appreciated the sacrifice, extended deepest sympathies on the death of PFC Thomas E. Kelly, presumed missing in action as of December 30, 1950, near the Chosen Reservoir, North Korea. There were instructions about personal effects, about contacting a casualty assistance officer. There was a place for a signature at the bottom that wasn't signed. The letter hadn't been sent. It had been made and kept and hidden. Maybe because nobody wanted to make it true. Anna put the page down slowly. For a moment she saw her own kitchen through someone else's eyes. A woman decades gone, at a small table with a dripping radiator and a stubborn lilac bush. holding a paper she refused to read because reading it would mean making it real. Maybe she'd tucked it into a box and placed the box behind a pipe, because some losses need a wall to lean against. Maybe she'd meant to come back. Maybe she never could. The oven beeped. The ordinary world knocked politely and stepped back in. Anna slid the letters back into their paper wrapping, laid the flag on top, closed the lid. She didn't latch it. Some doors shouldn't slam. After dinner, after homework and dishes and a fight over screen time that felt like a tired dance they both knew the steps to, Anna carried the box to the dining room and set it on the credenza beneath the family photos. Her father in his VFW cap, Ellie in a soccer jersey. The three of them at the lake in summer, sunlight burning the water white, the line of time marching. She opened her laptop and typed Rose Kelly Sycamore County into the search bar. A few clicks later, there she was, a blurry obituary from 1979, a church bulletin, a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and level eyes. The caption called her Rose Greeley Kelly. There was no mention of a husband. Instead, a litany of small dignities: choir member, seamstress, neighbor who kept a tin of cookies by the back door for anyone who needed one. Survived by no children listed. Her sister Edna Greeley. Anna leaned back. The house felt crowded, not with ghosts, but with the shape of people who had once sat where she sat, had once made choices here, what to keep, what to hide, what to hope for. She closed the browser and looked at the box again. On top of the letters, she placed a sticky note and wrote in ballpoint, "Find Rosie's grave, find any family." She didn't know exactly why, only that the past had set something on her table, and it was rude not to answer. In bed that night, the rain finally came, gentle as a memory that had learned not to shout. Anna listened to it rattle the gutters, and thought of a young man in a coat too thin for the weather, writing by the light of a lantern that stung his eyes. She pictured him folding a letter and tucking it into his left pocket, as if that could keep anything safe. When she slept, she dreamed of snow that burned like salt, of a frozen lake with footsteps stitched across it, of 4 boys smiling into a wind that wanted their teeth, and behind them, far behind them, a line that ran straight as a string across 70 years and came to rest in the middle of her kitchen, in a rusted green box with a latch that still worked if you were gentle. Morning would ask for lunches to be packed and a permission slip to be found, and a meeting with a student whose anger had started to look like armor. Morning would ask for the next right thing. But before the sun had even decided what to do, a story had already begun to move again, up from cold ground and into warm hands. The last letter from Korea had been waiting. Now finally it had been found. The young soldier. December snow fell differently in Korea. It wasn't the soft, playful powder kids in America kicked through on their way to school, nor the glittering flakes that landed on holiday windows. Here, in the winter of 1950, the snow felt alive, as if each crystal carried a bite of malice. It didn't settle, it cut, it stung cheeks, cracked lips, froze sweat into icy needles that clung to uniforms, long after the men had stopped moving. Private First Class Thomas E. Kelly had never known cold like this. Back home in Illinois, winter meant wool mittens knitted by his mother, steam curling from a mug of cocoa, and the smell of coal smoke wafting from chimneys. Here, the cold had teeth. It chewed through his boots and gnawed at his bones until his legs shook beneath him. He'd seen men collapse on the march, not because of bullets, but because their own blood could no longer keep them alive. The army had trained him to fight, to shoot, to follow orders without hesitation. But no one had trained him for silence. Out here, silence was louder than artillery. Sometimes, trudging through the endless white, he swore he could hear the snow itself, groaning underfoot, whispering through the trees, swallowing their voices before they reached the air. At 19, Thomas still carried the innocence of the farm. He thought about his sister's laughter, the way she'd chase fireflies barefoot across the summer grass. He thought about Rosie, sweet Rosie with her dark hair pinned back, the one who made him promise to come home. He had written her letters every week, sometimes every day, even when there was nothing to say. He wrote about the rations, about the long nights of standing guard, about the men who became his brothers. He never wrote about the fear, about the way the mountains seemed to close in like teeth, about the sound of boots disappearing in the snow behind him. He wanted Rosie to picture him strong, steady, unbroken. Still, the words he set down on paper carried more truth than he meant them to. He wrote of Moran's laughter, loud, brash, trying to drown out the world. Of Corporal Miller, who sang old country songs into the frozen night air. Of Jensen, quiet and watchful, always the last to sleep. And then, in the quiet moments, Thomas would pause. He'd press the paper to his knee, pencil hovering. Sometimes the words came in a rush, unstoppable. Sometimes they didn't come at all. He would stare at the horizon, the black line where mountains cut the stars, and wonder if Rosie would ever read what he wrote. The men around him had their own rituals. One soldier carved little figures from shell casings, tiny brass soldiers with faces worn by fingerprints. Another kept a Bible in his pocket, thumbing the pages until they were soft as cloth. They all had something to hold on to, some charm against the dark. Thomas had Rosie. Her letters were folded and unfolded until the creases split, until the ink bled into nothing. He carried one in his chest pocket at all times. It was a scrap of another life, pressed against his heart like armor. But armor only goes so far when the night is colder than steel. And in those nights, when the stars burned so sharp it hurt to look at them, Thomas would start a new letter. His hands shook so badly that his words slid across the page like tracks in the snow. "Dear Rosie," he wrote, "if I don't come back, I want you to know." He paused, pencil tip hovering, the ink smearing beneath his breath. What did he want her to know? That he still dreamed of home, that the war had changed him in ways he couldn't explain, that sometimes he feared he'd never be the boy she remembered. The words felt heavy, too heavy for paper, and so the sentence trailed off, unfinished. He folded it carefully anyway, and slid it into his pocket, where it rested against the others. The days stretched on, each one colder than the last. The men marched, they dug in, they waited, and somewhere deep in the snowbound silence, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It wasn't fear, it wasn't hope, it was something else, a weight he couldn't yet name. The frozen front. The winter sun in Korea wasn't like the one back home. It didn't warm the skin, didn't melt the frost that clung to every branch and rifle barrel. It was pale and distant, a reminder that the world could keep shining even as men froze to death in their foxholes. Thomas Kelly pulled his parka tighter, though the wool was already stiff with ice. The cold found every gap, every seam, every careless moment when he dared to loosen his grip on the rifle to stretch his fingers. He'd stopped feeling the tips hours ago. He wondered if frostbite hurt worse than a bullet. The chosen reservoir stretched out before them, a sheet of glass under the silver sky. The mountains reared up like jagged teeth, their slopes crawling with shadows that might have been trees or men. The Marines joked that the cold was worse than the enemy, but the truth was that both could kill you just as quick. Around the fire, the platoon tried to pretend they weren't sitting in the middle of a frozen graveyard. Moran cursed softly as he rubbed his hands together. "Jesus, it's colder than a witch's heart out here." "You ever met a witch?" asked Private Carter, his breath coming out in pale puffs. "Don't need to," Moran muttered. "I can tell you right now, if one showed up, she'd freeze to death before she could hex me." The men laughed, but the sound was brittle, like dry sticks snapping. Corporal Miller began humming again, low and tuneless, just enough to keep the silence from swallowing them whole. Ethan listened, grateful for the sound, even as the melody wavered and cracked in the cold. But when the laughter faded, the silence returned. It pressed against them, heavier than the rifles they carried. Ethan remembered the farmhouse back home, how quiet it had seemed when his father went out to the barn at night. He used to think silence was peace, but here, silence wasn't peace at all. It was waiting. It was the breath before a bullet. It was the sound of men listening for the crunch of boots that weren't their own. Every night, the same dread. Every night, the same ritual. He'd take out Rosie's latest letter, unfold it with careful fingers, trace the words she'd written about town gossip and the stubborn lilac bush. Then he'd start writing his own. "Rosie, the snow here glows at night. You'd think it was beautiful if you didn't know what it hides." He stopped. His hand shook. He stared at the blank space that waited for him to finish, and then he folded it up, slid it into his pocket, and leaned back against the frozen dirt, listening to the silence breathe. The order came just before dawn. "Move out. Pack everything. No questions." The men groaned, cursed, and rose to their feet, shouldering packs that felt twice their weight. Ethan felt the letters crinkle against his chest, close to his heart. He told himself they'd get out of the mountains, that he'd mail them to Rosie, that there was still time. But in the distance, beyond the frozen lake, the shadows were moving. Not like men, not like wind. Something slower, heavier, waiting. And as the first boot struck the ice, Ethan knew tomorrow's letter might never be finished. Brothers in arms. The march around the reservoir was not a march in the way Thomas had imagined it back in Illinois.
It wasn't the proud rhythm of boots on pavement, or the shining brass bands he remembered from parades. It was a slow, uneven procession of exhausted men, each step a negotiation with the frozen ground beneath them. Their rifles were heavy, their canteens filled with ice, their breaths shallow clouds that froze to their scarves and beards. Thomas walked in the middle of the column, his eyes fixed on the hunched back of Private Moran. The big man still carried his sketchbook of makeshift playing cards tucked into the strap of his pack. He turned occasionally, flashing that stubborn grin. "Bet you $5 I make it back home before you do," Moran muttered, teeth chattering. "You don't have $5, Thomas said, pulling his scarf higher. "Then I'll owe you," Moran said. "Don't worry, I'm good for it." From the rear, Corporal Miller began singing again, this time louder, almost defiantly. The tune was broken by coughs, but the rhythm kept the men's boots moving, one crunch after another in the snow. Jensen walked beside him, silent as always, his rifle cradled against his chest, eyes scanning the white ridges that rose on either side. At night, when they dug into the frozen earth to make shallow foxholes, the men gathered close, stealing warmth where they could. Frost clung to their eyelashes. Moran held up one of his homemade cards by the light of a flickering lantern. "Look at that, Kelly. Ace of spades. That's my lucky card. Means I get to see home." Thomas smirked, though his lips cracked. "Or it means you're carrying a target in your pocket." Moran laughed. "Guess we'll find out." Miller stopped humming just long enough to grin. "If we get out of here, I'm buying you both a drink. Hell, I'll buy the whole platoon a drink." "You don't drink," Jensen muttered. It was one of the few times Thomas had heard him speak in days. "Then I'll buy you one," Miller shot back, and the circle erupted in thin laughter that steamed into the night. But beneath the laughter, Thomas could see the fear in their eyes. He could hear it in the way their voices trembled, in the way they paused between sentences to listen to the silence outside. The enemy was out there, somewhere in the ridges, somewhere in the endless white. He pulled out Rosie's latest letter, the paper soft with wear. She'd written about the first snow back home, how Ellie had made a crooked snowman in the yard, how the lilac bush still refused to bloom. "Come home soon, Tom. The house is too quiet without you." He stared at the words until they blurred. Then he pulled out his own half-finished page. "Rosie," he wrote, "sometimes I think about that snowman. I wonder if you and Ellie are standing at the window, watching the flakes fall. Out here it's different. Out here the snow doesn't feel like winter. It feels like waiting, and I don't know what we're waiting for, except maybe the end of everything." He stopped, the pencil hanging in his hand. Across the fire, Moran caught his eye. For a moment Thomas thought about reading the words out loud, but then the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound, a low rumble, too steady to be thunder. The men froze, listening. Jensen set his rifle down, pressed an ear to the frozen ground. He looked up slowly, his face pale. "They're moving," he whispered. "A lot of them." The fire sputtered out in the snow. The night grew darker, and for the first time, Thomas felt the bonds that tied him to his brothers stretched taut, as if the cold itself was pulling them apart. The letter begins. The sound beneath the ice never really stopped. It was like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, thrumming up through the frozen ground into the men's boots. Thomas tried to convince himself it was just the cracking of the reservoir, the water shifting under the pressure of early winter. But the look on Jensen's face said otherwise. That night, when the platoon stopped to dig in again, Thomas found himself staring at the blank sheet of paper he'd pulled from the battered notebook he carried. His breath fogged over the page before his pencil even touched it. "Dear Rosie," he wrote carefully, the graphite scratching in small, uneven strokes. "I keep thinking of home, of the little things, the smell of your hair when you sit by the stove, the way the snow in Illinois piles soft, not like the glass here. Out here it cuts into your skin like shards. The men laugh about it, but I think they're just trying not to scream." He stopped. He rubbed his numb fingers together, willing warmth back into them. Across the fire, Moran was shuffling his paper deck. "Queen of Hearts, Tommy. That's Rosie, right? She'd be proud of you." Thomas tried to smile. "She'd be mad I let my socks freeze to my feet." Moran's grin flickered but held. Better frozen socks than no feet at all. The days dragged them deeper into the mountains. The wind whipped harder, and the sky was the color of ash. They moved at night, the ice cracking under their boots, the silence broken only by the creak of gear and the labored breaths of tired men. One morning Lieutenant Harris called the platoon together. His face was hard, jaw clenched tight. "We're heading north," he said. "Orders are to hold the line. Reinforcements are coming." Nobody believed him. Reinforcements were always coming. Somehow they never arrived. "North?" Miller asked, his voice thin with disbelief. "Sir, there's nothing north but more cold and more hills." Harris's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the mountains rose like a wall. "Orders are orders." Thomas felt the letters shift against his chest as he shouldered his pack. They were heavier now, as though the words inside knew what lay ahead. That night, when they dug into the frozen ground again, Thomas pulled out the half-finished letter. His pencil hovered. "If this one never reaches you, Rosie," he stopped. The men around him had grown quieter. Even Moran's jokes were tired now, fading at the edges. Millen no longer sang. Jensen stared into the dark as if he could see something moving out there, something none of them wanted to name. Thomas closed his eyes. He pictured Rosie's face, the way her smile tilted just slightly to the left. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to tell her nothing, so he wrote just one line. "If this letter never finds you, know that you were the reason I kept walking." He folded it, slid it into his pocket with the others, and leaned back against the frozen dirt. The hum under the ice had grown louder. Somewhere out in the night, beyond the ridges, a faint light flickered and was gone.
Battle. The order came at dawn. Snow crunched beneath boots as the platoon dragged themselves into formation. Their breath rose in ragged clouds, rifles slung heavy across their shoulders. The cold no longer shocked them. It had seeped into their bones, become part of them. Lieutenant Harris walked down the line, his voice low but firm. "We hold this ridge. No matter what happens tonight, no one falls behind. We stick together. Understood?" The men answered, voices dull with fatigue but steady. Thomas checked his rifle, fingers stiff on the metal. He could feel the folded letters pressed against his chest, right over his heart. Rosie's words warmed him in a way the fire never could. By nightfall, the wind screamed through the mountains. The sky tore open with snow and darkness. The men dug in along the ridge, their foxholes shallow, their sandbags frozen solid. Then came the sound, not just the groan of ice, not just the wind. Boots, many boots, a low thunder rolling through the snow. Jensen's whisper cut through the night. "They're here." The world exploded. Gunfire snapped through the dark like firecrackers. Tracer rounds slashed across the snow, red lines against white. Mortar shells bloomed in the distance, throwing up fountains of ice and dirt. Thomas pressed himself against the frozen earth, firing blind into the night. His shoulder jolted with every shot. The air reeked of cordite and blood. "On your left, Kelly," Moran shouted, swinging his rifle and cutting down a figure that seemed to rise from the snow itself. The man fell without a sound, disappearing into the drift like he'd never been there. Ethan's ears rang. His hands were numb, but he worked the bolt, fired again, ducked low. He saw Miller crouched on the other side of the hole, lips moving, singing again, even as bullets chewed the dirt around him. The song cracked, broken by gasps, but he kept at it. Hours blurred. The men fired until barrels glowed faint, until their fingers blistered through their gloves. For every shadow that fell, another rose. The ridge became a grave, each body swallowed by the snow. When the firing finally eased, Thomas realized his legs were soaked, not with snowmelt, but with something warm, sticky. He looked down and saw the spreading stain. His hands shook as he pressed against it, but the cold was stronger. Moran crouched beside him, face pale. "Stay with us, Tommy. Don't you dare quit now." Thomas tried to answer, but coughed instead, blood staining his scarf. He felt for his chest pocket, fingers brushing the edges of Rosie's letter. He pulled it out with trembling hands. The paper was damp, the graphite smudged, but the words were still there. He wanted to finish it. He wanted to say more, but the snow was louder now, louder than Miller's humming, louder than the gunfire. The men regrouped as the night stretched on. Some were missing, some were broken. They didn't count. Counting meant admitting who wasn't there. Thomas closed his eyes, the letter clutched tight in his hand. He whispered into the frozen air, not caring if anyone heard. "Rosie, I'm still walking, still carrying you. Don't forget me." The wind swallowed his words, carrying them somewhere far beyond the mountains, far beyond the snow, across oceans he might never see again. Silence. The morning after the firefight, the ridge was eerily quiet. No gunfire, no shouted orders, no enemy movement, only the whistle of the wind dragging across ice. The men moved like shadows, their faces hollowed by fatigue and hunger. Thomas tried to count the platoon, but the numbers slipped through his mind. Every time he looked, someone was missing. Moran was still there, still clutching his paper cards, though his jokes had died in the snow. Miller's humming had faded to silence, his lips cracked and still. Jensen remained alert, scanning the ridges with eyes that seemed to pierce through fog. They waited for orders, they waited for food, they waited for a sunrise that felt like it might never come. The silence grew heavier as the day dragged on. It pressed against their skulls, rattled in their bones. The men spoke less and less, their words dying in the air before they even reached another's ears. Thomas found himself listening for sounds that weren't there. Rosie's laughter, his sister's footsteps on the porch, the ticking of his mother's clock in the kitchen. But instead of comfort, the silence pressed harder. It was no longer the absence of sound, it was a weight. He pulled out the unfinished letter from his pocket. His hands shook, the pencil slipping against the damp page. He tried to write something, anything. "Rosie, if I fall here," but the rest of the line refused to come. That night, the fog rolled in thick, smothering the camp in grey. Thomas sat in his foxhole, his rifle across his knees. The shadows at the edge of the mist seemed to move, just slightly, just enough to keep his heart racing. Moran muttered from beside him, "It's too quiet. You hear it?" "Yeah," Thomas said softly. "I hear it." The fog pressed closer. Every breath sounded too loud. Every heartbeat felt like it might give them away. And in that crushing stillness, Thomas realized what the real enemy was. Not just the soldiers in the hills, not just the cold, but the silence itself, heavy, endless, suffocating. He pressed Rosie's letter to his chest and tried to remember the sound of her voice, but all he heard was the snow, groaning under its own weight. The return of the letter. 70 years had passed since the men of PFC Thomas Kelly's platoon vanished into the white silence of the Chosin Reservoir. Time had buried them deeper than the snow ever could, under layers of history, politics and forgetting. But the letters, their fragile voices on yellowed paper, had endured, hidden away in the crawl space beneath Anna's house. It was late afternoon when Anna finally drove out to the county library. The wind rattled the bare branches along the road, scattering brittle leaves across the windshield. She clutched the sealed army envelope in her lap, the paper crumbling at the edges, as though it had been waiting all these decades for someone, anyone, to carry it the rest of the way. At the archives desk, the librarian adjusted her glasses and peered at the name, Rose Kelly. Yes, she lived here, passed in 79, never remarried. Her voice softened. She worked as a seamstress. People said she was kind, kept mostly to herself after the war, always waiting for news, I think. Anna's throat tightened. She pictured Rosie, year after year, stepping onto her porch, scanning the road for a figure that never appeared. All the while the letter sat in the dark under the house, hidden behind a pipe. The librarian slid over an index card. "There's a niece, lives about 20 miles south, near the state line. Name's Margaret Ellis. Might be your best chance of finding family." Anna drove the 2-lane highway with the letter on the passenger seat, glancing at it every few minutes, as though it might vanish. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter than she meant to. This wasn't her story, she told herself. It wasn't her grief, but she was carrying it anyway. The Ellis house was small, brick, with faded blue shutters and a swing creaking in the yard. A woman in her 60s opened the door, her grey hair pinned back, her eyes sharp and wary. "Mrs. Ellis?" Anna asked. "My name's Anna Whitman. I live on Sycamore Street, in the house your aunt used to own." The woman's expression shifted, softening with a flicker of surprise. "Aunt Rosie's place? I haven't heard that name in years. Why are you here?" Anna held out the envelope. "I think this belongs to you, or at least it was meant for your family." Margaret hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling as she touched the brittle paper. She stared at the handwriting. "I know this," she whispered. "That's Tom's hand." Her knees gave slightly, and she gestured for Anna to come inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the envelope resting between them like a fragile truth. Margaret finally broke the seal, sliding out the letter that had been waiting 7 decades for her eyes. She read silently at first, then her lips moved, her breath caught on the words Thomas had written for Rosie, the promises, the small memories, the final unfinished line. "If this letter never finds you, know that you were the reason I kept walking." Tears welled, slipped down her cheeks. "She never stopped waiting," Margaret whispered. "Every day she'd walk to the window, look down that road. She never said his name out loud, not once, but she waited." Anna felt the weight in her chest shift, the silence she had been carrying, the ghosts that haunted her nights. It wasn't just hers. It belonged to them too. The town had carried it. The family had carried it. Maybe the world had, in some way. Margaret folded the letter with hands that shook but did not falter. He should be remembered, she said, not just as a name on a wall, as a man, as someone who loved. Anna nodded. Then let's tell his story. Outside, the wind swept across the yard, rattling the swing against the porch rail. But for once, the sound didn't feel like silence pressing down. It felt like an answer. The long road home. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Anna had experienced before. The letters, Thomas's words, frozen in time, spread across her dining room table. And each night after Ellie went to bed, she would sit under the dim light and read another. Some were unfinished, a line or two that trailed off into blank space. Others were whole, paragraphs of small comforts, stories about the men in his unit, the biting cold, and the little scraps of memory he clung to from home. Each sentence felt like a bridge across decades, a voice rising from beneath the ice of the chosen reservoir. Margaret began visiting once a week. She'd bring a tin of cookies, the same kind her Aunt Rosie used to bake, and the two women would sit at the table together, reading Thomas's words aloud. Sometimes Margaret laughed, a soft, surprised sound when she recognized a name or a detail from her aunt's life. Sometimes she cried, holding the fragile paper close, as though her aunt's grief had passed into her hands. One night after they finished a letter about Moran's ridiculous paper playing cards, Margaret leaned back in her chair. She kept that box. She must have hidden it herself. Why would she hide it? Anna asked. Margaret looked at her for a long time, eyes shining with a mix of sorrow and tenderness. Because if she didn't open that letter, then Tom wasn't gone. Not really. As long as the words stayed unread, he was still walking back to her. The thought settled in Anna's chest like a stone sinking into water. She understood. She understood too well. At the mill, life went on. Thomas still worked his shifts, stacking boxes, moving pallets. But something inside him had shifted. He found himself speaking more. When the younger men joked about leaving town for the city, he told them about the barracks, about long marches and sudden friendships that mattered more than medals. Caleb listened hardest. He'd sit with his notebook open, scribbling down phrases, nodding like each word was fuel. One afternoon, as they leaned against a stack of crates, Caleb said, "You make it sound real. Not like the books, not like the recruiters, just real." Thomas smiled faintly. That's all it was. Real. Hard, cold, and sometimes beautiful. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Regret's a heavy thing, heavier than my pack ever was. I don't regret serving, but I regret what it cost. I regret who I left behind." His hand brushed against his chest pocket out of habit, even though the letters were gone now, safe in Margaret's keeping. On Sundays, he started going to the cemetery. Not every week, but often enough that the caretaker began to recognize him. He found Rose Kelly's headstone near the lilac bush, its branches still stubborn, still refusing to bloom even after all these years. He would stand there, hands in his pockets, and tell her what he could. "Rosie," he'd whisper, "he never forgot you. He carried you with him, all the way to the end." Sometimes he thought he could almost hear a reply, soft as snow, low as the hum Miller used to sing at night. But maybe that was just the wind. The road home was long, longer than he ever imagined. But each step felt lighter now, as though the silence itself was slowly loosening its grip. He still woke in the night, ear ringing, heart pounding, shadows crowding the corners of the room. But instead of fighting them, he'd whisper Thomas's words into the dark. "If this letter never finds you, know that you were the reason I kept walking." And in the silence that followed, Ethan Kelly would close his eyes, not as a forgotten soldier, but as a man learning, slowly, painfully, that even lost voices can still be heard. Years later, on a quiet autumn morning, Ethan sat on the porch of a modest cabin tucked away in the woods of northern Vermont. The air was cool, tinged with the smell of pine and the distant smoke of fireplaces. His hair was thinner now, his hands more weathered, but there was a steadiness in his eyes that hadn't been there in decades. On his lap rested a small wooden box, the same one he had found buried beneath the floorboards of Rose's old farmhouse. He had promised Margaret he would keep it safe, and he had. Inside lay Thomas Kelly's letters, still fragile but preserved, their paper yellowed by time yet strong enough to survive the years. Margaret had passed away the previous winter, her absence leaving a quiet ache in the town. At her funeral, she asked that the letters be given back to Ethan. "You were the one meant to find them," she had said with a smile, her voice weak but sure. "Maybe you can carry him home in a way I never could." A letter read aloud. That morning, Ethan opened the box and carefully unfolded one of the last letters. His voice was rough, and he read it aloud to the trees and the wind, as if Thomas himself might hear. "If I don't make it back, tell my family I fought with everything I had. Tell them I thought of them every night. And if Rosie is still there, tell her I loved her. Tell her I never stopped." The words floated into the forest, carried away by the breeze. Ethan's throat tightened, but this time the tears didn't come with shame. They came with release. The journalist returns. A year after Margaret's passing, Daniel Carter, the journalist who had first convinced Ethan to share the story, drove up the dirt road to visit him. By then, Daniel's own career had shifted. His documentary on the Korean War letters had been picked up by a major streaming platform. It wasn't just a story anymore. It had become a movement. Families from across America reached out, sharing hidden letters, diaries, and memories of soldiers who had never come home. Daniel brought news. Thomas Kelly's name, once absent from any official memorial, had finally been added to a new wall dedicated to soldiers lost in action, but never recovered. "Your cousin is remembered now," Daniel said, "not just by us, but by the country." Ethan placed a weathered hand on the box of letters and nodded. It's what he deserved. Passing the torch. That evening, as the sky turned purple and the first stars appeared, Ethan handed Daniel a sealed envelope. "This one I never opened," he admitted. "It's addressed to Rosie, but she's gone now. I think maybe the world should hear it." Daniel accepted it with reverence, tucking it into his jacket. "I'll make sure his words live on." Ethan leaned back, listening to the forest breathe around him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel haunted. The ghosts of Korea hadn't vanished, but they had softened, turning from tormentors into companions. He whispered into the night, "You're home now, Thomas. You finally made it." Final reflection. War is often remembered for its victories and defeats, for the strategies and the politics, but the real war lives in the letters, the journals, the quiet memories that never make the history books. Behind every battle map is 1,000 small human stories of love, of loss, of fear, and of the fragile hope that someone will remember. Ethan Kelly had been one of those forgotten soldiers. For years, he carried the weight of silence, the laughter of others ringing louder than the gunfire he had once endured. But in the end, the discovery of a single wooden box gave him something that no medal, no government, no speech could provide: closure. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone walks the shores of Korea, they won't just see the sea. They'll hear the echo of Thomas Kelly's words, carried on the wind. "If I don't make it back, tell them I loved them. Tell them I never stopped." Don't miss the next story. Subscribe now and join us on this journey into history's hidden shadows.